Immortal Thor is officially dead. No, it's not clickbait, and yes, it's amazing. So, what this does, picking up after the last story that we did, and we'll get you guys caught up over the course of this video, we initially pick up with the return of Utgard Thor. Now, this is not some great big huge battle, and we'll explain Utgard Thor once we actually get to Utgard-Loki, because it'll just make more sense once we get to that point. But when Utgard Thor shows up here, because there's not a great big huge battle, the question is, who did this to him? Because keep in mind, the last time that Utgard Thor and Immortal Thor fought, Immortal Thor was pretty well overwhelmed, right? I mean, it was kind of nuts how powerful this elder god was. But the fact that he's basically dying, it leads to Thor to ask the question, who did this? What's going on? Like, what happened? And that's where the answer that Utgard Thor gives is a little cryptic. He says, in your heart, you know Thor, but you hope it is not true. You are a being of compassion. Compassion that you infected me with like a plague when I gained your cursed power. This is not my doing, Thor. It is yours. And so where Thor asks, who was it that did this? The response of Utgard Thor, you know that as well, and yet you hope it is not true. And so Tyrannos tells this story. But we're told how he returned to Utgard to take his place among the Utgard gods as their equal, how he spoke to them as an equal. Charged with Thor's own compassion, he reached out to them, hoping that they would see the righteousness of his cause, how he argued and then pleaded and then begged again and again for the Utgard gods to see his side and to show mercy. But there was no mercy in them. The endless city forged steel that could pierce an elder god's flesh. The great bull gored him and knocked him to the ground. The hooded one took up the hammer, and under the Utgard-Loki's mocking eye, they nailed him to his wheel, and they literally send him back here. Now, him showing up here is actually more of a message than anything else, and we'll actually find it's actually an invitation, because what he says is that if I could no longer be their messenger, then I would become their message, and they sent me here to face my end in a sky I have never known. I am dying, and so the message is this: the bridge across the great river known as Vimir that you crossed long ago with Loki, it has returned, and beyond it is the gate to Utgard's land. The gate will soon open, Thor, and someone must pass through it, one way or the other. And now I am done. And he literally just dies. And so Thor gives him a kind of farewell of sorts, and then at that point, the question is, what do we do, right? How do we respond to this? Because if the gates to Utgard are open, then it's only a matter of time before Asgard and Midgard, basically Earth, are completely eradicated. And so Thor goes on this mission. He literally heads straight to the gate. And when he gets there, he finds Skurge the Executioner and Thanos waiting on him. Now, let's provide some context here, because one of the things to know about Scourge is that he has died and been reborn so many times, because what Scourge has right now is something called the bloodaxe, and it's quite literally an axe that he has that has been infused with a piece of his own soul. And so it grants a massive power-up to Scourge himself, makes him far more powerful than he's traditionally been. But at the same time, if Scourge were to die, he would die forever. And in fact, this is explained to him by Odin, specifically when Scourge has this kind of vision of basically Thor's final battle, right? When Thor's going to die. He travels and he meets with Odin in Valhalla. Now, at this point in time, Scourge is basically already dead. So he resides in Valhalla, and that's because he had died a warrior's death, fending off the forces of hell in order to save Thor. Now, of course, Odin has been dead for quite some time, and as you would expect, Odin is now the king of Valhalla, the throne that he would take because he's the one that essentially created the place. But the idea here is that when Scourge tells Odin of what had happened, specifically the dream he has, Odin initially says, I will not have it, Scourge. I have seen love's flame turn to ash in my lover's eyes. I have died to my own magic and lived as hammer and as anvil. All this I have done to see my son upon his throne as the true king. And now when he has at last learned all he must to rule the Golden Realm, you say his tale must end. I say thee, nay, I will not have it. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because this is kind of Odin's own personal irritation here, right? Thor was sent down to Earth in the form of Donald Blake in order to learn what it meant to be humble, to learn what it meant to be a true king, to be among those people that he would rule. Over the years in Marvel Comics, decades even, Thor has gone from this exceedingly arrogant individual to becoming a tried and true superhero. And over these various stories, these trials and torments that he's endured, finally, following the death of Odin, he has become the very king Odin had always hoped he would be. And now he's about to die. And so Odin's just like, you're going to go back there and you're going to make sure he doesn't. Because one of the things that's cool is that Scourge responds and he's like, how, right? Like, I've left too many times already. The door is barred to me now by Brunhild herself. I fear that you cannot open it. And Odin freaks out, right? He absolutely loses it, right? Behold, Odin, am I not the way of ways? Am I not the wonder of wonders? Behold me, Scourge. And so that's where Scourge is like, no insult was intended here, right? I simply meant to say, you're dead. And so you don't have the ability to open the doors of Valhalla the way you traditionally would if you were alive. We are here as a kind of afterlife, but we can't really leave unless Brunhild allows us to, right? Brunhild, of course, being Valkyrie or one of the people who have played Valkyrie over the years. But that's where Odin tells him, I am Odin, right? I know all the back doors in and out of this place. So I will get you out and you will go prevent my son from dying. But understand, if you die in this task, you will be confined to Vidblane, right? You will never be able to come back. Now, you guys have seen this place before, even if you don't fully recognize it. It first appeared during J. Michael Straczynski's run on Thor in the aftermath of Civil War, so basically Thor's return. If you guys remember that iconic scene where Thor's wearing a kind of like white robe and he's standing in what looks like this very desolate landscape, that's that, right? That's Vidblane. It is basically the final stop for gods, right? That if you are someone like Thor and you die an honorable death, you travel to Valhalla. But if by some manner you were to leave Valhalla and you were to be killed again, you would travel to that realm and there's no conceivable means of escape. And so that's what led to Scourge showing up here. Now, the initial battle between the two is incredibly fascinating because throughout this entire conflict, Thanos talks to Thor. What's crazy is that Scourge cannot see Thanos. He doesn't know he's there. And even when Thor addresses him directly, right, he asks the question, are you truly Thanos? The response, oh no, nothing so small as that. And so the battle is on. Now it's extremely fierce, right? Because by and large, Scourge is trying to prevent Thor from going through this gate. And Scourge knows there's really nothing he can do to stop him. And that if it comes down to it, Scourge will have to sacrifice himself to prevent that from happening. He's basically trying to force Thor's hand, right? Put Thor in a position to where either Thor will have to kill him or Thor will have to walk away. And so hopefully Thor will end up walking away. But throughout all of this, Thor muses to himself about what's happening. He says, even if that is Thanos, I cannot be distracted. Scourge means to take my place on this quest, to steal whatever destiny the fates intend for me, and he will not hold back. His blood is up, and in his eyes, I need only be alive at the battle's end, not in one piece. And that's where Thanos chimes in and says, too true, and if anyone can chop the Allfather into pieces, it's proud Scourge, whose bloodaxe whistles like the cutting wind, while you can barely use yours to shield yourself. The whole time, Thanos is basically just toying with him, right? Musing with him, giving him a hard time, trying to throw him off kilter. And so when Thor is talking to Scourge throughout this battle, like, can't you see Thanos behind there? Thanos finally chimes in and says, he cannot see me, Thor. He hasn't earned me yet. I am still the face of your death. And the question that Thor asks is, why? Why are you the face of my death? And the response of Thanos, it is the face you associate with your end, Odin's son, the face you have learned to fear, to hate, to fight whenever you see it. And now, will you really fight to open this gate and join me? Now, what Thanos is talking about here, right? Because clearly this is not actually Thanos, and it's going to be nuts when we find out what's really going on. That if you guys remember during Donny Cates' run on Thor, that Thor had encountered the Black Black Winter. Basically, in the same way that Galactus creates the Silver Surfer as a herald, the Black Winter basically uses Galactus as his herald. Now, that whole mythology has basically been undone in recent years, but the vision that Thor saw from the Black Winter remains, which is to say, Thor had this vision of his end, which was Thanos wielding Mjolnir with the Infinity Stones attached, plus the Death Stone, leading an army of the dead, basically against everybody. And so Thor knew that his end had come there. It'd be the only way that Thanos could get a hold of Mjolnir would be by prying it from the cold, dead hand of Thor. And so in the face of that, Thor came to this realization, like Thor largely associates Thanos with his own demise. Now, of course, that whole arc of Thanos basically capturing Mjolnir and the Infinity Stones and the Death Stone, that had all basically been undone. And Thanos ended up creating the Death Stone through a different means by confining Mistress Death to an Infinity Stone itself. But the fact is, right, because of the fact that Thor still fears his death at the hands of Thanos, that's the reason why this face has been taken. And so throughout all of this, Thanos basically goads him on and on and on. What will you do, Thor? Do you know that when Thor makes statements about the value of human life, about the value of what it means to fight for something greater than himself, the response of Thanos, the mortals do not care about you or even about themselves. At every turn, when faced with even a glimmer of light, they choose darkness. They cannot be saved any more than Scourge can. They want to die and they want to kill everything else. That is what people are, Thor, a self-hating disease. How can you disagree when it is so self-evident? Why must you die for them now, Thor? They choose to kill the world. Don't they deserve to face the consequences? And that's where Thor's whole response here is, it doesn't matter, right? Like, I fight on behalf of people, right? I fight on behalf of those who were unable to stand up for themselves. So even if the world only had 1,000 people, 100 people, one person in it who is willing to fight for a righteous cause greater than their own, then I will fight alongside them. And that's where Thor basically breaks the rules. He looks to Scourge and says, you have a choice here, right? Either you can basically beat me to a pulp, this battle can go on and on and on, or you can join me on this quest and do everything you can to make sure that I do not die. And so ultimately, Scourge joins him. And it's actually a really, really cool thing, because when that happens, basically Thanos disappears. The gate opens and Thor officially enters the Utgard realm. And at that moment, you end up realizing the whole thing is being watched by Utgard-Loki. Now, what is going on here with the Utgard? Okay, for those of you guys who remember the old Roy Thomas days in Marvel Comics, where he was running over the idea of like the Elder Gods and a lot of other writers who did the same thing, one of the things that we had learned was that in the very early days of Earth, you had Elder Gods like Set, Chthon, people like that, that what ended up happening was that because these Elder Gods had just kind of fallen into a state of degeneracy and waged war against each other, that they basically were defeated by a being called Atum, who was essentially the offspring of Gaia. And so Atum, as basically the god killer, started traveling around the earth and wiping out virtually every elder god he came across. Those who were not destroyed fled to other dimensions, right? So Set went to his dimension, Chthon went to the Flickering Realms, right? Sidorak went to the Crimson Dimension, and so on and so forth. And so what we've learned over the course of Al Ewing's run on Thor is that you had Utgard-Loki, Utgard Thor, and a few other people who were also elder gods. But unlike Chthon and Set, who took off to their own dimensions and wouldn't let anybody else join them, Utgard-Loki had created the Utgard realm as basically a safe space for all the other elder gods that were willing to join him. Now, this is the important difference between Utgard-Loki and Loki, or Utgard Thor and Thor, that Loki is the god of tricks, right? Which means he plays tricks on people. Utgard-Loki represents the concept of a trick. And so you could make a credible argument that he is way more powerful than Loki is. Now, I don't want to get into a huge debate about God of Stories Loki and yada, yada, yada. I'm not interested in that, right? But what is important here is this. These guys are monstrously powerful. They are immensely powerful, because what you're basically doing here in fighting these guys is you're fighting a concept. And so Utgard-Loki gives this really interesting monologue where he says, Loki is the Skald of all the realms, but this is no realm, as realms are counted. I am the Utgard-Loki. Here, I am the trickster, tamer of monsters, and teller of tales. Here, I am master magician, and this is a magic trick. How many coins am I holding? And where initially we would say 1, he actually flicks them around and says, wrong. I hold no coins. A coin is what it does. If it has no value, if it has no part of a greater bargain, is it not truly a coin, only a disc of metal? When a coin becomes a coin, it becomes a symbol for an entire system, a dying planet, for example, or an endless city. The coin is the city, and the city is the coin. And the coin is a trap, because when a coin is a coin, it is 2 coins, and each side, each face, pays you back in its own way. Tails, the serpent encircles you as it eats itself, circles the world, an enemy prophesies but never defeated. The coin takes you back to what you thought you'd left behind. Heads, now the coin is with you. It moves you on, pushes you forward, but to what and for what? What waits at the end of the maze? So it's very, very clandestine and cloak and dagger. The reality here is that it is kind of open to interpretation. I really look at it more from the perspective of storytelling. Thor is a comic book character and is effectively trapped inside of his own story. That his story is one of death and rebirth, right? Kind of a criticism to a degree. Al Ewing's well known for doing that, right? That the same story just gets recycled over and over and over again, but just in different ways. That there is no such thing as a unique story anymore. So it's really fascinating, right? How you can interpret this and view it. Some people kind of view it as more of like a criticism of capitalism or something like that. I don't know. But the bigger point is this: Thor basically wakes up within the endless city. And when that happens, he and Scourge start traversing the place. Now, there are these kind of forces here that try to attack them and try to destroy them and so on and so forth. But along the way, they start running into some familiar faces. Specifically, they run into Hermod. Now, here's a cool thing about Hermod, right? This ties into the earlier run on Thor, and specifically Jonathan Hickman's gods. The idea of Skinner boxes, right? That those individuals put inside Skinner boxes are brainwashed into following the teachings of oblivion. Specifically, what had happened was that Thor's brother Tyr had actually been put into a Skinner box and was ultimately possessed by oblivion, and that Hermod was basically killed, right? He was believed to have been destroyed. Not only that, Heimdall was essentially lost as well. Now, Heimdall's story is a little bit different. We'll kind of cross that bridge when we get to it. But the fact is, Hermod is now here, and being a being of incredible speed, is able to kind of traverse this place and at least give them information, help them try to find a way out. But he's basically been stuck here the entire time, kind of lost in this bit of an otherworldly purgatory. But that leads into Heimdall, because Hermod says, there was another, one who died in battle, yet forsook Valhalla, whose last wish was for his spirit to go beyond the realms that he had seen. He was granted that boon by the Valkyrie Jane Foster, and now Heimdall, the bridge keeper, is within the endless city. What's being referred to here is the death of Heimdall, which actually resulted in him being killed by Bullseye. Yes, Bullseye killed a god. Let me know if you guys want me to cover that. And then the second thing that had happened is that when Heimdall had died, he had actually requested to travel to the far shore, right? The place beyond all known existence, which was given to him. Now, how it was that he ended up in the endless city, we don't have an answer to. And honestly, that answer isn't really important, because now at this point, it's a matter of finding Heimdall. Because if they can find Heimdall and he is in any kind of condition to assist them, Heimdall is incredibly capable. Even if his sister Sif has inherited his powers, so he doesn't really have the all-seeing eyes the way that he traditionally would, if he's capable, he's powerful, and he's one heck of an ally to have. And so as this goes on and on and on, ultimately Thor, Scourge, and Hermod end up coming across the Great Bull. Now, this is where the story gets really awesome, because again, hearkening back to that original god war between Atum and the Elder Gods, one of the things that we were not aware of, and this is basically a retcon to that story, is that Kemur, is how I pronounce it, is basically just this leader of the Elder Gods. He was the king of the Elder Gods at that point in time, and seemingly the one who led them all into a state of degeneracy in the first place. When Atum ascended and began the process of destroying Elder Gods, the first battle took place between Atum and Kemur, right? It was the first real conflict, that this kind of god killer versus the king of gods. Everybody stood back and everybody held their breath to see what would happen. And that, of course, as we know, given the history of Marvel, Atum ultimately won. And so this led to Kemur basically being stuck here within the Endless City. But he is incredibly powerful as well. That's the nature of these elder gods, because this fight initially comes down to Thor launching a kind of test, right, to see what it is this guy's capable of and how powerful he actually is. And Thor is overwhelmed like that. I mean, he's overwhelmed so quickly. This guy's strength, his speed, just the sheer ferocity of his attacks is way more than Thor was prepared for. Even using Mjolnir and throwing it at him is not enough to defeat this guy. And so one of the things that Thor realizes is that they need an attack on two fronts, that they need to launch a strike that'll basically be a distraction and presumably a killing blow. Not only that, Thor also has his golden belt, right? Utgard. Basically, that was a belt that he fashioned for himself after he defeated Zeus and took Zeus's power. That's also happened in the Thor stories. There's a playlist if you need to get caught up on all that stuff. But basically, it's a huge power boost. He did this largely because Loki told him that this was all going to happen. Loki didn't go into details, but said along this journey that Thor was taking, he would need magical weapons and allies in order to ultimately win. Thor's beginning to put the pieces together and realizing what Loki was referring to. So he literally takes this belt and fashions it into essentially a nose ring and uses Mjolnir and launches an attack against this guy. And when that happens, he hooks the ring into his nose. And for the first time in seemingly ages, Kemur actually understands what it means to feel pain, right? To feel the burning sensation of a god attacking him and causing an injury to him. And in fact, this is one of the coolest elements of the story, because what we're told here is that as a tomb raised a fiery hand, Kemur ran. With his sword in hand, he ran. With his horns like knives, he ran. On his trampling hooves, he ran and hid and cowered, and he prayed to a tomb god-killer that his dreadful fire might leave none behind who knew the truth that Kemur had basically etched into stone that day, which is that all kings are cowards, that the strength of any king is a lie, true to only those who would believe it. And so Thor is no coward, that Thor is not like this guy. It's the fundamental difference between the two. When faced with battle and presumably his own death, Thor does not run and hide and cower. Thor stands in the face of it. And in that realization, Thor realized this guy's just a bag of hot air and nothing more. And so what it does is it allows Thor to be a distraction while Scourge brings the guy down. But then the killing blow comes from the most unlikely place. Literally, it comes from Loki, who fires off an arrow made from Eternity's mask. Now, this was crazy when it happened because I completely forgot about this. For those of you guys who don't know, the Eternity mask was actually attained by Loki in Defenders Beyond, right? The story with Blue Marvel and America Chavez and all those guys. But the nature of the Eternity mask is that it ties into like King Arthur's legend and all that kind of stuff, but it's made from a piece of eternity. The individual who wields it will immediately have a level of power equal to the person they're fighting. And so Loki pulling off his shard of the Eternity mask and then firing it as an arrow into Kemur's face, that's what allows them to kill this guy. Had that not been the case, Thor would have been killed, but he would have been destroyed. And so now Loki is part of the equation, and the journey goes on. Because as this conflict continues, Thor's biggest concern now is that the gates to Utgard are open, and it's entirely possible here this is all a distraction, right? That the main focus of those within the realm of Utgard, they want to send their own forces into Asgard and into Midgard, right? While Thor's over here dealing with that. And so his goal is to get back to the gate and to basically find a way to close it. But once they get there, Utgard-Loki is already there and he destroys the gate. So essentially they're trapped in this place. There is no exit. And so where initially Thor starts making his way back into the Endless City and Loki's basically disappeared, that Hermod is taken off in order to find aid within Asgard itself, that Scourge is tasked with guarding the Black Bridge and making sure that should Thor fall and the forces of Utgard come storming the bridge and the gate is effectively recreated by Utgard-Loki, that Scourge would be able to hold them off for as long as he possibly can until Hermod can return with forces from Asgard. And so this leads to Thor facing off against the Hooded One. Now the fight's not overly lengthy, it's relatively quick, and in fact the Hooded One initially strikes basically unseen. It does taunt Thor, and in this moment where it's about to deal this killing blow, Thor calls down the full totality of the thunder, right? Every ounce of power he has, and with the force of the All-Father, kills this guy on the spot. Now, it's also awesome because it's kind of a callback to Infinity issue number 4, I think it was, where Thor killed the Builder, in the sense that because he's wielding two weapons, both an axe and Mjolnir, he had thrown his axe Tormod just off into the distance, which the hooded one didn't notice. Thor recalls it back to him, and the axe basically punches a hole through this guy, and that's how Hermod dies. And so basically, with the forces of the Endless City defeated, Thor's victorious here, right? Like, Thor comes out on top, and that with Hermod basically showing up to Asgard and then telling everybody what's going on, you have Sif, you have Scourge, who greet Thor at the end of the Black Bridge and basically celebrate the fact that he's come out on top, only for Loki to turn around and stab him in the back and kill him on the spot, which is crazy. I never expected Thor to die at the hands of Loki, of all people, because in that moment, Thor is basically just laying there dead, right? Murdered. But in reality, it's because he was sacrificed. He wasn't outright killed out of malice or vengeance by Loki, because in that moment, what ends up happening here is Loki speaks directly with Utgard-Loki, who's curious about why it is that Loki would even do this in the first place. And Loki's very clandestine here. He says, "Would you know more, old trickster? More will be told." And Loki just disappears, right? And so at that point, Utgard-Loki's just kind of like, okay, this is a little weird. Not quite what I was expecting, but let's see how this unfolds. Because what ends up going on here is that Scourge starts to realize the only way to prevent the forces of Utgard from invading Midgard or even Asgard is to destroy the Black Bridge, to eradicate it in its entirety. Now, in the process, he sacrifices himself, and he falls into the realm of Vidblane. But that was not the only thing that was lost, because the reality here is that the Black Bridge was the opposite side of the Rainbow Bridge, two sides of the same coin. Hence the whole explanation given by Utgard-Loki in the beginning with his whole monologue, and that with the destruction of the Black Bridge also comes the destruction of the Rainbow Bridge. Now, here's the difference, is that with this destruction having taken place, it's not something as simple as just the Rainbow Bridge is destroyed and Asgard is cut off from Earth. No. These are huge shockwaves that actually impact the very fabric of reality itself. So much so that Thor has been forgotten. The world doesn't remember Thor at all. And in fact, history is being rewritten in such a way that now it was Beta Ray Bill who was a founding member of the Avengers, not Thor. Thor's never existed. And in fact, that's what Sif says. I can see it like a wave passing over all the Midgard realm, a wave of forgetting, of rewriting the stories. Once again, we are myth to them, stories only. We were never there. And so they're completely and totally cut off. And so at that point, you pick up with Thor, who is now trapped in the realm of Vidblane. And this is where it gets wild, because while Thor is here, he kind of gets frustrated, starts to lash out, starts to get irritated, and is like, I want answers. Someone give me answers. And at that point, those who sit above in shadow appear. Now, for those of you guys who don't know about their whole history, they've been around for quite some time in Marvel. And in fact, during the final days of Loki and the ending of Dan Slott's Silver Surfer run, going into Secret Wars 2015, Loki hypothesized that those who sit above in darkness were actually Beyonders, or at least at some point were Beyonders. The biggest legacy they leave in Marvel is that the cycle of Ragnarok, the death and destruction of Asgard itself and all the Asgardians inside of it, that those who sit above in shadow feed on that. But they give this very, very clandestine explanation because they kind of tease what's to come next. What they say is, first, I know that King Odin died, and in Valhalla, King Odin must remain. Second, I know that Odin, One Eye, is greater than a king. Third, I know that a seeker of knowledge will always seek it more. Fourth, I know that two paths diverge, one long, one tragic short. Fifth, I know to beware ambition in two forms. Sixth, I know that where I see a throne, I see a grave. Number 7, I know that you walk the path of sacrifice as Odin did before. 8, I know that you sacrifice yourself to yourself as Odin did before. And 9, I know that you must walk where Odin could not before, on a path not yet taken. Now that is an incredibly important statement, because what happens next is Donald Blake appears. Now, the whole Donald Blake storyline had seemingly been wrapped up quite some time ago. And one of the things that we had found out was that there came a point when Thor and Donald Blake would switch, that Donald Blake would basically be sent to this almost kind of paradise-esque type place. But Donald Blake was basically going insane, so much so that he became a villain, right? He became a bad guy. And when that happened, he actually tried to kill Thor and seize control of Asgard. Now, of course, there is a bit more to that explanation than what I'm giving you here, and again, that's all part of the Thor playlist. But the fact is that last we saw Donald Blake, he was chained down in the dungeons of Asgard with the world serpent basically seeping poison into his eyes, where he was supposed to remain for all eternity. But with Thor dead, Donald Blake was brought here as well. And so there's a kind of fight that breaks out between the two of them when Donald Blake basically conjures up Helnir. Now, Helnir is a throwback to the King in Black storyline, where basically it is a demonic version of Mjolnir. It's basically a reflection of the twisted and evil person that Donald Blake has become. But what's important here is that the two of them go back and forth and back and forth, and Donald Blake expresses so much frustration and so much anger over Thor talking about how this is madness and so on and so forth, because again, the anger that Donald Blake harbors is such that he felt forgotten, right? That Thor had not turned into Donald Blake for so long, that Donald Blake was kind of trapped inside this prison. So there is a lot of anger being held here. Not only that, for his actions, Donald Blake was confined to a dungeon to be tortured for all of eternity. So he knows nothing but anger. And that's why he says, this is not madness. This is correcting Odin's mistake, because arrogance with a smile is still arrogance, because a kindly king is still a king, because some lessons you can only learn through sacrifice. And literally takes Thor's eyes away from him, and it just kind of continues on. Now, what ends up happening is that Thor, realizing that there really is no stopping Donald Blake here, there's no talking him down, there's no calming him down, there's no getting him to a place where he sees reason, Thor says, "You say I am too much the immortal, as you yourself embrace the role Loki set for you, as I now see the spell Loki wove around me. For if we are both gods and neither mortal, then between the two of us, there is a human soul that goes spare, a human life. Let there be a new sacrifice then, a sacrifice of all power and pride, of myself to myself, a sacrifice beyond mere death. Let the winter of gods come, and let it come now." Because in that moment, Thor grabs Helnir and slams it into the ground. And when that happens, it unleashes this massive explosion that has two huge revelations. The first is that Donald Blake is effectively a serpent, right? And we're told that the great serpent who wore the name of Donald Blake, but could never be that again, screamed. And then the ends of Vidblane. Yet there was no god left to answer him. And though he gazed to the end of eternity, there was no star to guide him, no bird to show him a sign, naught but stillness and silence. Thor was gone, for a while at least. And then what ends up happening is you pick up in this alleyway. Now, there is this kid named Loki, and in fact, that's a throwback to basically the whole story with Loki that we don't necessarily have to go into here. Kind of the rebirth of a character to a degree. But Thor is just in this alley, has no knowledge of who he actually is. And the question that Loki asks him is, do you know who you are, right? Think hard. What's coming back? Who are you? Anybody interesting? Anybody special? And Thor just says, my name is Sigurd. Sigurd Jarlson. It's the old school story of Thor, right? From like the Dan Jurgens days in like the 80s. It's dope. Like, I'm so excited to see where they go, because now Thor's just a mortal. He's just a regular guy. And Al Ewing's story continues on. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.